Hey folks, I wanted to give a great example of how biased the teaching of history is regarding the 20th century. Folks, the Chinese Communist Party took power in 1949. That's the year the People's Republic of China was declared. That's when the Communist Party came to power. But many years before that, 1928, 1929, and 1930, there was a horrendous famine in China. This famine was caused for a number of reasons, most of which can be traced back to capitalism. One of the primary causes of the famine was the fact that the people in China didn't have food because there had been crop failures. And part of the reason that these crop failures were so dramatic was because so much of the arable land in China, where food should have been grown, was being used to grow opium poppies, right? And that's supply and demand. There wasn't money to be made by feeding the Chinese people, but there was money to be made for the international capitalist system and free trade and the British Empire in growing opium poppies. That was supply and demand in action. In fact, let's not forget that the British Empire waged two different opium wars to force China to join the global free trade Adam Smith system, tear down any tariffs and barriers and be part of the free trade system. And one great staple of that free trade system that the British and American big multinational bankers and corporations were pushing at the time was opium. A lot of American bankers, a lot of British bankers were involved in the drug trade. And at the time this famine happened, 1928 to 1930, in China, a lot of the arable land was not being used to grow food. It was being used to grow something that was much more profitable for capitalists: opium poppies. Furthermore, China didn't have a strong central government that could be mobilized to carry out relief. The Chinese government was so corrupt and bought off by, multinational corporations and bankers and warlords and local interests, and it was so corrupted by capitalists, was being auctioned off to the highest bidder. When this famine hit and millions of people were dying, couldn't get food, the government was paralyzed. It really had no ability to mobilize an effective relief. Now, this famine that happened between 1928 and 1930 in China, 3 years, people were dying in northern China. And while that was happening, the estimates were maybe 3 million people had died. Now historians believe that roughly maybe 10 million people died during this 3-year period in northern China. Horrendous. But you'll notice that the Wikipedia page about this famine in China caused by capitalism is only 3 sentences long. Let me repeat that. The Wikipedia page about this famine caused by capitalism in China is only 3 sentences long. However, we all know there was another famine in China called the Great Leap Forward, where there were some economic hardships that happened in the early 1960s after the Communist Party had been in power, after the Soviet Union had cut off its aid to China. And look at the Wikipedia page for the Great Leap Forward. Paragraphs and paragraphs and paragraphs, all repeating this same narrative that somehow this one famine proves that communism has never worked anywhere and that free market capitalism is the only system. The reason that there are 3 sentences about a famine that took place because of capitalism and many paragraphs, just a whole big article about a famine that happened under the leadership of the Communist Party is because the famine that happened under the leadership of the Communist Party has propaganda value for Western capitalism. It is something they can use to demonize the Chinese Communist Party, to promote free trade and globalization, to promote privatizations and austerity in Western countries, to promote their myth that greed is good and that capitalism is just an amazing system. And because it has propaganda value, all kinds of things are written about it. In fact, there's even a book that was published about the Great Leap Forward. The photo that is on the cover of this book called Mao's Great Famine is actually from 1946. It was in Time Life magazine. It was one of their photos, and it was in 1946 that this child was photographed being hungry before the communists even took power. That's from another famine, right? So it's not even a picture from the Great Leap Forward, but it's on the cover of this book demonizing the Chinese Communist Party. But no one discusses this famine that happened from 1928 to 1930, where 3 to 10 million people, probably closer to 10 million people, died because of capitalism. It's not relevant. And this famine that occurred from 1928 to 1930 in China was one of many. These kinds of famines happened all the time under capitalism. And it was the Chinese Communist Party that industrialized China. It was the Chinese Communist Party that built power plants all over China. It's because of the Chinese Communist Party that 800 million people have been lifted out of poverty. Now, today, China's economy that has 5-year economic plans, that has a huge number of state-run banks and industries, led by a communist party grounded in Marxist-Leninist ideology, socialism with Chinese characteristics, is the second largest economy in the entire world. Huge economic achievements have happened. However, if you listen to the discourse in the United States, you'll hear all about a famine that happened in the early 60s. And this famine, in which capitalism killed millions of Chinese people, you're getting a biased narrative of events. You shouldn't need any further proof of this than that. The fact that you thought communism leads to everyone starving, and you never heard about all the famines caused by capitalism. Furthermore, no one ever bothered to point out that it was communists that made China into a global superpower that it is today, shows that you are being served a completely biased and ridiculous narrative.